Yeah.
Magdalene Moonsamy, welcome to Troublemakers.
Oh, thank you so much, Phil Wilmot, for
Yes,
having me
it's super
at
great to have you
TCDC.
here.
Yeah, it's great to be here, I have
Mm.
to say. A lot of oxygen, hey?
So much oxygen, yeah.
Yeah.
Native trees,
Native
some
trees.
other trees as well, but yeah.
Yeah, the oxygen is good out here.
Yeah, it is, it is. So today we're talking about by any means necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And this as a phrase has been attached a lot to Malcolm X, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
And well, I think we can begin there. Why did you pick this topic?
Yeah, I think, I don't think I know that for certain, the global shift, the geopolitical shift globally is a cause for concern. You know, from not just experience that is held experience, first hand experience, but also from what we have experienced firsthand in our country, and we're now dealing with in a post apartheid state. You find yourself in a situation where during apartheid, what was the project? How were we able to achieve what we had achieved in terms of upliftment of sanctions, going into democracy, negotiated settlement, which I have got no confidence in? But what were the means? What were the strategy and tactics around being able to go from an apartheid state into a democratic state, constitutionally driven? So I feel that this resonates also in our current situation globally, but also insofar as the continent, its regions, its states. What is the state of the continent? What is the state globally? How does a continent gain resilience? What means does the continent have to be in a position to exalt and to confer African unity, to ensure that African unity becomes really the ground, the fundamental foundation of which we cannot be, the neo-colonialist, the tendencies of African liberation. Are we able to cope? Were we given coping mechanisms to step out of the colonial period into liberation? And why are we so easily manageable and controlled? Do we have the skills? Do we have the leadership? Do we have structures for accountability? So that is why I think the topic is relevant, because we have to look at, I think, as a generation, what kind of preparation needs to be done insofar as what we leave behind. What footprint are we leaving behind? What did our forefathers leave? What footprint did they leave that we can either fit into or say no? The shoes were too small, or were they too large? So I think that for me is why when we look at this topic in particular, it resonates. Yeah.
I've seen the goalposts for this conversation change. I'm only in my mid-30s, you know, and I've only been in this movement thing since maybe my late teens, you know. And already I see the discourse around by any means necessary, i.e., possibly armed struggle, possibly violence, and the whole kind of like nonviolence, purity of means and ends being coinciding. The perspectives on this conversation are not what they used to be. The goalposts are different. And I want to kind of like ask you the question, well, maybe you feel otherwise, but if you don't, why are those goalposts different? I've observed that there are some groups within kind of like movement culture, activism, that are kind of like puritanically nonviolent. And sometimes maybe that's been strategic, but it almost comes across as kind of like a dogma. Um, and the data right now is showing us that in the past few years, neither, if we can make this the simple bifurcation of a nonviolent movement and a violent movement, movements in general, regardless of their means of struggle, are not succeeding at the rates of success that they were in the past. Both are down to around 10% success rate, regardless of the means of struggle. So there's something about this historical moment that feels different. The discourse around this conversation is different, and also the conditions are different. Um, and uh, just the other day, you were on a webinar about Western Sahara, and of course, all of the recent events came up in conversation. By recent events, we're talking about, the U.S. Israel axis and all of the outbreak of war that they are sparking. Um, this moment feels peculiar, and um, perhaps it's like a good time to unpack this by any means necessary thing. I don't know if you feel similarly, or but could you kind of like lay out what are we facing right now, 2025, mid 2025? What are we facing right now, and how does that relate to this conversation?
I think we must define violence first, before we understand what nonviolence means. Because if you are trying to tip the scales from nonviolence to against vis-a-vis violence, you'll find that they are very two extreme approaches to try and
Mm.
secure some kind of a resolution on any issue. And violence is forceful. It creates threat, intimidation. It has the aspect of potential um, use of ammunition, death, killing, genocide. The implications of violence are such that it is targeted in some instances, and in some it is a blatant, um, just wiping out a group or wiping out a population of people. So I think that is the first perspective. The reason why there are many activist groups who um, want to be on the nonviolent with genuine intentions, I would assume.
Mm.
But for those who purport such and are simply just gathering intelligence, coming across like people want peace. That is the nature of people.
Mm-hmm.
People are not naturally violent. And we know this from the continent. I mean, we've never had situations in the continent where, and I'm not speaking about, this is pre colonial, even before, when you even read Evelyn Reed's The Women's Revolution, Evolution of Women, etc., Evolution of Society. You understand the egalitarian nature that society had. Um, so naturally, it was not about occupation. People were purely, living um, in their comfort. Where yes, you go out, you bring in the food, and so the circle of life continues until greed became an aspect of where territory, expansion of territory, was then an import of the mentality over. Okay, I wanna now. I see my depletion of food and resources for my community or my people, I must now go in and expand my territory. So we do know that, in the continent, other continents as well, there was similar um, uh, behaviors. But for me, I think the issue of nonviolence is not one that is directly um, one to neutralize or to negotiate peace. It's not potential because already when you look at a hot-headed situation where there is violence, where there is war, where there is no consideration for civilian life. I'm not saying that there is no there is a need for war. But sometimes when I look at what Tolstoy speaks about, and he reflects then on the issue in War and Peace, on the building of cooperatives, that's exactly what he's doing. He's taking us back into a nonviolent environment, because you depend on each other. You can't hurt each other. You can't steal from each other, because your productivity and your product is completely different from your neighbor.
Mm.
So there's no competitive monopolization of something that is unique to that is shared by everyone. So in this current trajectory, 2025, we are going into the second half of the year. A lot has happened. Violence has escalated. And when we have to look at what are the means, the backtracking, I think, of anyone at this point, it's a matter of egos. Occupation is an ego. It's an ego trip, a financial ego trip. It's the ego trip of, what military strength do you have? What level of patriotism do you have? Remember those things that secure a nation and its sovereignty. It's its patriotism, its military, and its borders. And when you have a population that's patriotic, irrespective, that unites behind you take 9/11, for example, and you saw how, the nation, the American nation, come together, remembering those who have fallen, and what a tragedy it was. Now, you don't need a tragedy for unity. You don't need war to unify your people. But if you take a unilateral decision to then, as a leader of a nation, to call for war, to invite it, the situation in Ukraine, as it subsided for a while, if you recall back, I think in 2016, around there, when the initial kind of like bits and pieces, the temptation of war was there, NATO then came in to feed Ukraine, so that it became more armed and is strengthened. And then you had the subsequent all-out war. You take a non-violent organization into an environment of that nature, which is hopefully providing humanitarian aid, and not just there to understand why there shouldn't be violence, because you've passed the point already. And that humanitarian aid is taken away. What is the virtue or the value of that non-violent organization in a state of that kind of in that situation? We reflect on the situation in the continent. What have NGOs done? There's one example I like to reflect on. It's the sterilization of women in India, where the organizations came, and this is why the suspicion, I'm going to the issue of the suspicion around nonviolent movements, become rolls over into different continents, into different regions, in continents and states, etc. There was an organization that went in, a women's movement, that wanted to look at the issues of whether women were there was domestic violence, and how women are surviving. And what they were done was they were sterilized. So the ultimate goal, which was not made clear, it was not part of the agenda, was subdued, was not mentioned, sorry. And hence you had women who unconsciously were sterilized because they thought they were getting injections to protect them against disease. They were being protected for many other reasons. And a woman who's not given birth in order to decrease the population. And this organization obviously did not come from India itself, but it got the inroad through the leadership. And that's where we're going back to ultimately in this conversation, I would think. And And so you robbed the woman of the opportunity of having a child because you're overpopulated. Whose decision is that? Is it the decision of the woman, or is it the decision of the country or the NGO, for that matter? Can we refer to that as nonviolent? Because I think that's an act of violence against a woman.
Systematically so.
Systematically so, yes. So you're using the issue of nonviolence to invasively, physically invasively, take away the right of a woman. And this is where I think Roe versus Wade comes in the United States, where the option of an abortion was, under any circumstances, became illegal. You'd be arrested. I mean, you look at the aspects of rape, the aspects of, am I ready to have a child? It was in the moment, or whatever the case is. And I think that case in particular, in point, links directly to the issue of, is that an act of non-violence against a woman who has been through violence and would rather take a hanger or kill themselves and pull the baby out, or because, I mean, you have to find a state or you have to find somewhere to go in order to have that abortion. And I'm simplifying it I'm simplifying it, and I say this with humility around that aspect, because the nature of violence, characterized globally through wars of occupation and empires that have been established, have been very male and testosterone driven. So for me, I want to now go into the aspect of the leadership and capacitated leadership, and where we are in 2025 as a continent. Have we done our due diligence on each other? Do we understand when we say by any means necessary? When Malcolm X speaks that language, it literally means by any means necessary to protect the human being. Mm-hmm. And the human being, when we speak about human rights, I think that that's also something that we fail to understand, that there's a person. There's a person in this human. It's not just a characterization of what we saw when we went to the museum, a primate and then a habilis, and then Homo sapien, kind of a characterization of what we've evolved into. There's a person there. So that person has their own understanding of the dynamics. It may be naive, it may be sophisticated, it may be something that they can contribute towards, but it's a person. Don't just classify us as human beings when human beings have no right in the context of war, in the context of conflict. Women and children, we take child soldiers, for example, in the continent, not just in this continent, but elsewhere, conscription, etc., where children have got absolutely, they are, the impressionability of a child at that age is so critical, because you want them young, you want to feed the propaganda, you want to do so you come in to do, and this is, I think, a conversation that we had at some point as well, when we asked the question, where are they now? Have they now been in a position, because they were NGOs, in the name of nonviolence, to come in and to try and do some kind of rehabilitation? So when we are looking at 2025, the current global situation, I think one of the things we need to understand is that from the onset, and what was very fascinating for me was one, when we went to the museum, the early tools that were used in Tanzania, the sickle, and
Just for
Also,
listeners' sake, we went to the Arusha Declaration Museum in Arusha, Tanzania.
yes. Also, the circumcision tool, which stood out for me, because it showed you what the role of men needed to be even back in the earlier times. They had to go through a trauma in order to become a man. They had to have that experience. And then when Mama C shows us her little instruments that she had gotten from Ghana, that she carries very sacredly in her bag, what does it mean? It means that there was a time when there was a cultural solidarity, unification of the continent, in the continent, of its people, irrespective of the diversity and the difference. And then it started to evolve, whether it was after colonialism or during the period. Because I do not believe, if you take the project in India, there had to be those that were taken over in order to initiate. So those who were of Indian descent had to go in and be part of the strategy of the British, in order for the British to gain entry, and then those wars, and then their independence, being one of the oldest democracies in the world. But is it a democracy? Do we have genuine democracies on this continent in Africa? Do we have an African democracy? So what does that mean? What are the goals? And then what are the means to the end? Because when we speak about violence in the continent, we're not speaking about some slap across the face, We're speaking about landmine-ridden parts of the continent where we don't have the technology for landmine dispensing of landmines. I've tried that myself to find landmine detectors. And the cost at which it comes. I mean, a kid is playing somewhere and steps on a landmine, And these are going to be the consequences, even if of the war, where there's grenades that are found, etc., in Ukraine, in Israel, in Palestine, sorry, and what is going on with Iran. We're going to find that where we were as a continent, even before the First and the Second World War, through colonization, it was to amp up like those who would give their lives to the Francophone, to the Anglophone, and whichever other split in the continent took place, so that they would become, once you are taken in, you have a dual passport, you form part of the military. These are then slaves, because we are a very populous continent, in order to also look at the mineral resource aspect. So I think that where we are right now and where we need to be in terms of understanding nonviolence is to understand, how do we accelerate on the pressure? What are the means that we need to use to engage? We can't engage on the same process, because there's no difference from what's happening now, because it's still mineral resource gain. It's still, these guys in the 1400s, in the 1500s, when they occupied the Americas, it wasn't by chance. They found something that they wanted. And hence, you had Carlotta, for example, in Cuba. Carlotta was a descendant of Africa. And Carlotta started a war with a machete because there was sugar. Remember, Cuba is at that point rich in sugar and in tobacco, or what is it, cigars. That's tobacco leaves that are used for cigars. And Carlotta started a revolution just by mobilizing the other slaves. And what are we doing now? Because we can't fix everything, but we need to create a kind of an example that ignites. If we speak about the Arab Spring in Tunisia, what was it? How did it start? Facebook, social media. And that was effective in terms of shutting down, the government's thinking. Those things now have become more about selfies and stuff than it is about revolutionary thinking.
Well, also the algorithms have been researched into, and tech bros have manipulated them for their own politics, their own profits. So, I mean, the viability of using like social media as a platform to mobilize, like it's changed since that time.
Precisely. So I think in terms of the goalposts, where do we put our goalposts? Do we put our goalposts, do we respond to Trump insofar as, okay, you don't want my country in your country. You don't want my people in your country. Why do I want your people in my country? You classify a group of people, you give them special privilege of refugee status because they were in a genocide, apparently, of farm killings. But what about the native South Africans whose land that belongs to, who are also black farmers and who have been killed? Is this now going back to the issue of classification? Because when we're going into conversation from what is classified as from us being these primates into being Homo sapiens and then being human beings. That is just my analysis, blatantly of this evolution of who we are. But then there's the race aspect. So it was only the African continent that had, the barbarians are not even from the African continent. The barbarians come from the European history. And if you understand what happened, the Mongol Empire, the capturing of land and territory, the shrinking of the Mongolese Empire, it wasn't by chance. It wasn't something that happened without thinking. What were the implements used? There were giant footprints that were found. Footprints that they collected of a foot. We have that in our museum in Cape Town in South Africa, Iziko Museum in Cape Town, South Africa. It's near Parliament, where you find the footprint of what seems to be a woman, of a maybe a size 12 or 13 shoe. So when we also look then at what is it that history and prehistoric times and moving then into occupation, it's nothing new. The only thing new is technology. So when we move the goalpost, we don't move the goalposts from occupation. Occupation is always going to be there. People are always going to have the thirst for power. It's never going to be a simplified issue of saying we can stop the war. It's the matter of what are the implements that are used. At that point, it was iron and what was it? Spears and arrows and shields and horses. Now you're using B-52 bombers. Mm-hmm. So I think that is where we need to understand the goalpost in terms of technology. Mm. And then start reverting to the extent of what violence means now, current day, with that technology, with nuclear technology.
So, Maggie, we're not just talking about weapons, are we? Like in the classical sense, we're talking about gerrymandering, for example. You know, there are violences, systematic violences that deprive people of life at such a large scale that are not necessarily a landmine or, you know, those are the easy things to point to talk about violence. But what you're describing, what you're describing here is more systematic. It's a disruption um, of history. Um, you talked of a pre-colonial time with a relatively egalitarian society. That's almost unfathomable on this planet in most places in 2025. There are so many layers that we have to peel back in order to build anything that would resemble egalitarianism at a large scale. And if we are indeed, if the goalposts now we're talking about nuclear bombs and, you know, nuclear armament, B-52s, AK-47s, et cetera, what is? I mean, it seems like you're trying to say that we look at the goal of what we want and we figure out how to get there, and that's where we get this by any means necessary thing. Am I
Yeah.
hearing that from you? So if that's the case, where we are now is nuclear armament, B-52s, countries that just randomly, in an unprovoked fashion, bomb the shit out of real humans. Colonization, capitalism, you know, these are such massive. Globalization is global, you know. So this is where we are. So then, what are those means that can get us to the goal?
Yeah, well, I think the means one is the means of intelligence, the intelligentsia, understanding the intelligentsia of, and I think that that's something that people in NGOs and nonviolence, etc., don't want to go into because now it's accessible. You don't need to go out there and be a spy and look like some dodgy person with a hat and smoking a cigar on the side of the
Battered
street
fedora
by
and
the
a trench coat.
train platform, you know, the platform of the train station or something, to see who's getting in and getting out.
Who's doing the dirty policies?
Yeah, like,
and yeah,
who's this person? Doesn't look like they're from here. They're not speaking in the dialect. Now it is out there. AI
no,
is
openly
there.
on TV, we see who the baddies are and what they're doing.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then you have the technology yourself. You know, AI is there. So why are we shy about it? Why are we shy about, you know, those who want to play around with the system of AI to provide the kind of necessary information advancement? You know, give us the information as those who are concerned, so we can say, okay, fine. Here we're sitting in a house with 25 women and children, okay, and you know. These are the things that you read from Afghan diaries, for example. You're sitting in this house, you got 25 women and children. They need to remain silent once the alert comes on. Okay, we already know the time of that alert, so get out of there before, you know. And I think we need to look at what are the means. Because those means, I think, in the times of X and King and well, many other revolutionaries all over the world, Biko, Nyerere, Nkrumah, Machel, Gaddafi. What was the sustainability of Libya, and what was the reason for its absolute demise? But how were they able? I mean, the reality is that we need to say to those who are too old, can you kindly excuse yourself from the room? Because they do not understand the relativity of the times. And I think that
they will not do that, though. They will not kindly excuse themselves.
Well, then you remove, either you have to kindly remove them either through the ballot, or you have to bring a motion of no confidence. And this is what the means are, by all means necessary means. There has to be a people's voice that is heard. I mean, There are enough unemployed people on this continent. There are enough hungry people on this continent.
To go into the room and physically remove that
To
person.
exactly, out of hunger, out of poverty, out of lack of economy. I mean, you take what happened in the Niger Delta. When the women decided, we are occupying this delta, no oil leaves without our right to a percentage of that oil. You're not negotiating without us.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to negotiate with us, we don't give you sex.
Mm-hmm.
So that for me, I think, is a means of saying, okay, fine. And this takes women, because who is ultimately needing to put the food into the mouth of a child? Who is ultimately the creator of nations? So I strongly believe that the women's movement and the elevation of women in society, the right qualitative type of woman in society, it needs to become pronounced. And I'm not saying this because I'm a woman.
No.
I really am not.
But unpack the qualitative comment that you just
The
made.
qualitative is not one where you're going to have a woman who is going to be like you have in Tanzania. A woman who's going to be doing a female president, because that also I find quite fascinating. That there's a president of Zambia, there's a president in Tanzania, Zanzibar, sorry, and then Tanzania, and then there's another president. And from what I understand is that, I mean, the economy of scale, when I saw Seedco, I was walking along the road and I saw Seedco, and people say no, that they are not allowed to actually, it's illegal to trade without the permission of the state on something like rice.
That you are planting, you the farmer.
You understand?
In your community, on your land, perhaps.
Maize, which is the basic form of nutrition, let alone beans, which has protein. And you bring in foreign direct investment to control your country. You're doing your roads for having tourists come in, not realizing the conditions where people cannot then become entrepreneurs of their own. I've been looking for a flag.
Yeah.
And a hat or a beret with a flag on it.
Something that has the Tanzania emblems to take home.
What the point in this is, where's the patriotism? How do you expect your people to be patriotic when they're not having the flags hoisted in their schools or hoisted in their homes or just for sale on the streets? You know, I saw a bus with Traore at the back of it.
But Maggie, don't you know that the patriotism is measured by your ability to shut up, let Suluhu, your president, negotiate with Seedco or a similar, with foreign direct investment, with just shut up, don't talk about it, because that's the nation at work. Even though none of those people are Tanzanians. Don't you know this, Maggie?
Yeah, I don't relate with it because I can't believe that if you want to go to vote, that I don't believe that there's even genuine elections that are legitimate in this country. And I'm not saying this as a means of undermining what the ultimate or what the founding fathers of the Organization of African Unity intended, but it is actually a slap in their faces. And it goes into the region. What are the regional dynamics? I mean, you go into West Africa, the regional dynamics of West Africa. You then have to find. We went to South Sudan. We find that the South Sudan is more afraid of the rebels and the militia in the mountains than to make decisions at the level of parliament, and then want to defer responsibility. So if you're going to defer responsibility, defer power as well. That is by any means necessary. You cannot just say you need to do this. You need to give power over. So when I say step out of the room, I'm saying leave with your dignity intact. Don't force us to take you out of power, whether it is through the ballot and the pen and not the sword. Leave with your dignity intact. Allow the people's determination. And it's the same principle that we spoke about in the webinar, where we speak about self-determination and the semantics of the United Nations. I have a very, very fundamental issue with it, even the African Union. I mean, I look at the Constitutive Act of the African Union. You could have drafted that while you were just sitting in a corner there with a typewriter. You know, there's nothing substantial. It is so, it has not escalated since its formation into a constitution. Peace and security is like 2 paragraphs. When you are sitting in a continent where there is wars that are going on, you know, where there are refugees, there are asylum seekers. We take South Africa, we look at the conditions of our people. We've got more foreign, authenticated and prisoners in our prisons than we have South Africans. What does that mean? We've lost power as a nation. Our sovereignty, our military, and our patriotic nature is dwindled. Now we've turned into what is classified as a xenophobic country, simply because right next door to where I live is a store of an illegal person. You can be legal and open a store. I'm very happy with that. And next door, there is a South African woman who cannot feed her kids. And then, you know, there was an incident just 2 days ago in South Africa where the Pakistani community refused a South African to open a grocery store because it was too close to their grocery store. Fired shots at them, tried to kill them. It ended up becoming a political issue. That's the other aspect. When you say nonviolence and you bring nonviolence in, you are coming in from an apolitical, unbiased standpoint. But ultimately, the issue is political. Food is a political issue. Employment is political. Because now it is a matter of, let me advance the interests of those that I know. Whether they've got a degree or a completed school or not. No, that is neither here nor there. Let us take them and put them in because we know that we are going to be having sycophants. So the sycophant culture on the continent has to be eroded. How do we then shape the minds? How do we then request or engage a sycophant? Because that is where the nonviolent aspect comes in. Because a sycophant is going to beat you up as soon as you say, can we engage on this issue that you are advancing? On the issue of why are the people of this country not given the opportunity? Because agriculture, we know this from what we've experienced throughout the time that we've been here, is the main source of revenue. It's your GDP, apart from tourism, of course. So agriculture is food. You are a bread basket to your own people, and yet you don't allow your own people to sell to their people on an open market, in a market, and then you bring in fair trade. What is fair trade? Fair trade doesn't work for Africa. It's a construct of the West. What are you getting in exchange for that fair trade? Something that you don't need? Are you getting, the one thing I think, even though I have some challenges with China, you can see the product of China's footprint in a country in terms of infrastructure. I mean, you look at Addis. In Addis, there is the Sheraton, there is the AU, which is beautiful, exquisite. When you stay at the Sheraton and you look, sorry, I don't mean to sound bougie, but that is because it's one of the conference sites. And then you look over the window, outside the window, what do you see? Shacks, informal settlements, sewerage running all over the place, no water. And it's on an incline. So if there's any kind of wind or climate change activity that happens, that's, people's lives are at risk.
Completely disorganized and
precisely.
affected, yeah.
So for me, I think by any means necessary requires creativity and innovation. And I think that the battle of ideas is where we will be able to catch leadership, incompetent leadership, selfish leadership, leadership that is driven by economic self-enrichment for themselves and for those around them, with their pants down. Because the idea of nonviolence is not one to be dismissed, but the tactical approach is no longer to meet and speak to the converted. It's to challenge the status quo and to say, okay, I will give you an example with the Western Sahara and Morocco. Never in any of my engagements that I've done publicly where there's an audience has there been, even though that organization or institute may have invited, the Moroccans, etc., to give their side of the story, have they ever been present? They were once called by, they called Salam Media to say they wanted an interview. They wanted to speak. And immediately I was called. Oh, Morocco wants to talk. Come in. Fine. We go in. We're speaking to each other on the same issue. Why is that? Because when it comes to engagement, you can empty your pockets. You can launch your rockets. You can kill your people and you can kill people of other nations. When it comes to the battle of ideas, you're as lost as they come. So for me, we need to revisit the nonviolent, because if you are protesting and you're protesting on principles and on facts, this is so-and-so was murdered by the state, murdered by, there was an incident where in Kashmir, a 7-year-old girl was raped by policemen. It was a number of policemen. And I got involved in a protest against, and I started to escalate the against it and look for the perpetrators. But the community knew they were policemen because they have their uniforms on, Indian policemen. I was then attacked by the people of Prime Minister Modi. It was 250 men from India and South Africa who were saying that I'm a product of rape, so they are going to show me for having taken on Modi's regime. Do you know Modi took all his cabinet ministers onto the streets when those policemen were going to court, and the protest was to get them released. Cabinet ministers with people behind them wanting to release a group of police officers who raped a 7-year-old child. So I simply responded and I said, it's fine, I don't have a problem being raped. Make sure you give me a venue, a date and a time in a public area where there are cameras. And that's where it ended. Because the bullish nature that we are exposed to because of capital, because of the ability to have the resources, to have the ammunition, to be able to wipe out a person, disappearances, all of these things, it needs to stop. You want me? Find me, do it publicly. Don't be clandestine about it. And that is now our approach. Let's use the kind of skills and resources that we have in this current day, because we never had the kind of information that we had now. When we had to get, I remember there was a point in the 90s when we had to get faxes from, at that time it was called Shell House. A fax, standing there waiting for a fax to come through. And from the president, whether it was a memorandum or a directive, etc., a fax. Now we are on speed dial, and we have people here, who is organizing one of the programs. How do we capture the opportunity to educate? Just plant the seed, plant the idea. Because you see, there are many people, even in the movement of nonprofits and non-governmental organizations. It does not mean by default that you are not associated, you are not governmental, that you are an organization that has principle and has a value stream. It's not by default. But some way, that seed that is planted can be that by any means necessary. Because we do not know the environment that individuals come from, where they're easily able to mobilize and able to. This is why you have.
Think that's my biggest problem with the whole conversation. Framing sort of Malcolm X versus Gandhi. It seems to say like there are two options on these extreme binaries. And we know enough about everybody's kind of contextual conditions. This is for apologists of both camps, right? So you have like a contingent on the left that kind of thinks violence is like this cleansing force. It's the only thing the system can understand. It does so much violence to us. Nonviolence doesn't have enough power. So ergo, we use armed struggle to, it's almost like the goal is the means, And the same for the camp that's saying, strict puritanical nonviolence, by our definition, is like the only legitimate way to achieve the change that you want and for that change to be holistically realized, et cetera, et cetera. The simple fact is, human beings have all kinds of conditions, wherever they might be, similar or different than one another to some extent. We don't know what they are. Whatever that seed is that's going to be planted, the idea that we have control, like the ability to police what that seed is and how somebody is going to plant it. I mean, where does that attitude come from?
Coming soon on Troublemakers.
The level of opportunism of a man who 90% of the people that came into South Africa were slaves, and the remaining were brought in by Gandhi were merchants, which is why you have a very significant, very wealthy Indian community who all love Gandhi because their history. And I don't not love Gandhi because he didn't give my family money or something for them to establish themselves and to be merchants or entrepreneurs, as you would call it in current day. But it's because he ran a cooperative where he had, people he was self-sufficient. He comes in, he starts negotiating with the British on African soil, establishes a political party, takes that political party into the confidence of the British. Many fortunate, privileged Indians were then adopted into this kind of culture and given that, dispensed of that, privilege was dispensed upon them. And what could they care any further about those who were brought up in poverty, those who understand what it is like to have a huge pot with one tea bag floating around it to feed 8 children and 2 parents, and then you just put in sugar and that's what you're going to have for dinner.